Well, look what we have here. This is a Fender, 1964 Fender Princeton Reverb. Obviously a blackface. And the owner of this amp wanted me to take a look at it and make sure everything's cool. He did some work to it. I think he said he did a recap, he put some tubes in it. But he wants me to go through it and make sure everything's right and check the bias and that sort of stuff. So that's what I'm going to do. But this amp's in beautiful condition for its age. A lot of guitar players would love to have this thing. But you're going to need about $1,500, maybe $3,000 cash laying around. The camera I'm using right here doesn't do close-ups very well. I don't know why I keep using it for that. But anyway, right there is where the chassis number is, and this camera just doesn't pick it up. And I tried to get this, but I switched cameras to get the close-up stuff. So here's the tube chart. Notice it has a GZ34. That comes into play here pretty soon. They call this a AA764, unit number 2, and there is the chassis code, which means it is a 1964. Now there is a bit of confusion as to which is the right schematic for this amp, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. Here's a Jensen C10Q 8-ohm speaker. The date code says it was made in 2009. So we're going to go look for this schematic, and if you remember, the tube chart showed it as AA764, as you can see here. So what we're going to do is scroll down this list until we find the AA764, which is a Fender Vibro Champ. Now, a Fender Vibro Champ is nothing to do with the Princeton Reverb. This is a single-ended 6V6 amp with a 5Y3 rectifier tube. Nothing in common with the Princeton Reverb. So if you keep searching the internet, you'll find this same AA764 designation on a Fender Bronco, and you'll find it on just a Fender Champ. So here you see the Fender Princeton Reverb AA1164 schematic, one with a 5U4 and one with a GZ34. The tube chart on the amp I'm working on says it's a GZ34, so we're going to start out with this schematic. And what I'm going to do is check the components that are actually in the amp against that schematic, and I'll verify whether it's actually the right schematic or not. Now, as you saw on the tube chart, the amp calls for a GZ34 rectifier tube, but what's in there is a 5U4, and they're not directly interchangeable. They can be, but the 5U4 draws some additional current. It's a 3 amp draw, whereas the GZ34 is a little less than 2. Plus the GZ34 has a 10 volt voltage drop, and the GZ34 or the 5U4 has a 50 volt. So you're going to lose some plate voltage with that 5U4. So we're going to take a look inside the chassis and see what we've got here. Right off the bat, I can see he still has the depth capacitor in place and wired with the ground switch. And we'll talk to him about that. I generally bypass the ground switch and take out the depth cap, but he really wants to keep this thing original, and I get that. But in actuality, I'm not really doing any work to this amplifier. If I was actually bringing that into my shop and doing a full repair, I would put up a fight about sending this out with a depth cap in place and the ground switch still functioning. I don't like doing that. So I'll explain that all to him. So I looked everything over really good, compared it to the layout that I have that came with that 1164 schematic, and it's the right one. Everything lines up perfectly. Everything's there. So there's really no confusion. If you go on that Tubes and More site, there'll be two schematics, one for the 5U4 and one for the GZ34. Now I notice here that he has this cap can rotated 180 degrees, and normally that's a problem, but in this one, all of the four capacitors that are in there are all the same. So that is not that big of an issue, and it's not worth taking the whole thing apart just to get the little squares and triangles lined up. It's not worth it. So I'm going to do a bit of a quick check on those blue molded coupling capacitors. They're generally very sturdy. So I can check voltage on one side and check it on the other. These happen to be coupling caps that go to the output tube, so you should see plenty of negative voltage on one side. Never any positive DC on one side of those coupling capacitors. If you see that, you've got a problem. So I'll move down the line and check the other ones. Those are on the preamp tubes, so they should just basically read 0 on one side. They might have 200 volts on the other side, but on the side heading for the grid of the next tube, better not have any. That is not a definitive test for those capacitors, by the way. You have to at least unsolder one end to put that on the tester, but I'm not going to bother with it. So I went around through there and checked resistor values, and I also checked voltages coming off the transformer, and I want to make sure all that was right. So now we're running a bias test. I generally test for plate current if I have the right bias probes for the tubes that I'm testing. It's the most direct method, but it can be a little dangerous if you're not paying attention. So it looks like we're going to end up with about 25 milliamps on one and 23.5 or so on the other. So in a bit I'll go in and do a little math, and all you do is you multiply the amps times volts to get watts. And that 6V6 GT can handle about 14 watts of plate dissipation. So I did my math, and it looks like the bias is about 70%, which is perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the output on this, see what we can tell. So I got the scope on there, I got my signal generator, I got my dummy load. So we'll go ahead and ramp this up a little bit until it starts to square off, and it's going to be about 9.3 volts. 9.2, 9.3. Now, I have a true RMS meter that I have on there too. You can't see it, but it actually is a little higher than that. So as the way it is now, he's getting about 12 watts out of it. I think it's capable of 14 in push-pull, but because he has that 5U4 instead of the GZ34, he's losing about 40 volts of plate voltage, which very well may make all that difference. I'm not sure. I'd like to check it out to see if I did swap it out. I don't have one, but if I did swap it out with the GZ34, that plate voltage is definitely going up. But then other things happen. Sometimes you can, with higher plate voltage, you have to reduce your plate current. And that's when you can start running into problems with crossover distortion. Other issues is we may have to rebias completely with the different voltages, which on this amp is not easy. It's a pain. At first glance, looking at the schematic, it says, oh, here's the bias control right there. There's the pot. All I got to do is adjust that pot, and I got to adjust the bias. No, that's part of the vibrato circuit. And the only way you're going to adjust the bias on these two output tubes is with that resistor and that resistor. Some combination of the two to finally get where you want to go. And I don't know if you know this, but resistors don't come in fine increments. So it can be a real pain in the ass. One of the popular mods with this particular amplifier is you just take out one of those two resistors I showed you, and you replace it with a variable resistor, a little PC board pot. And now you've got your adjustment. So I'm going to recommend that he just leave this amp just like it is. There's no reason to mess with it, except maybe reach in there and snip off that death capacitor. That's useless and dangerous if you ask me. And once he cuts that lead off to that capacitor, then the switch does nothing. So that's an easy fix. So that's it for this one, and thanks again for watching.